The ground shakes without warning, buildings tremble on their foundations, and in an instant everything changes. That sound, that deep, rumbling growl from the earth itself, is one of nature's most terrifying reminders of how little control we truly have. But what if I told you that some of America's earthquakes didn't just leave behind destruction, they left behind stories so bizarre, so utterly unexpected, they sound like something out of a wild, tall tale. From towns that vanished overnight to rivers that ran backward, these aren't your average disaster accounts. These are the strange, the unexplained, the moments where the earth didn't just move, it played tricks on us. Picture this: a quiet Missouri morning in 1811, the sky clear, the air still. Then, without warning, the Mississippi River begins to churn like a boiling pot, sandbars rise and vanish in seconds, and church bells ring hundreds of miles away, all because of an earthquake so powerful it temporarily reversed the flow of the river itself. Or how about the time a small town in California disappeared entirely after a quake, swallowed by the earth as if it had never existed? These aren't myths. They're real events etched into history, defying logic and leaving us with more questions than answers. That's exactly what we're diving into today: the 25 strangest earthquake stories in American history. We'll uncover the oddities, the coincidences, the moments where science meets the supernatural. You'll hear about phantom quakes that shook cities with no fault line in sight, bizarre animal behavior that warned of disaster before it struck, and even a legendary earthquake that may have been caused by, well, let's just say extraterrestrial theories got involved. By the end of this journey, you'll never look at the ground beneath your feet the same way again. So buckle up, because the earth has secrets, and we're about to dig them up. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 didn't just shake the earth, they rewrote the rules of what an earthquake could do. Picture the Mississippi River, that mighty, unstoppable force of nature, suddenly grinding to a halt, then flowing backward. For hours, the river surged in reverse, its currents thrown into chaos as the land itself convulsed. Boats were stranded, fish flopped on suddenly dry riverbanks, and witnesses swore the world had turned upside down. But that was just the beginning. Then came the lights, glowing streaks in the sky, like distant fireballs or flickering lanterns, reported by terrified settlers from Missouri to South Carolina. Scientists still debate what caused them. Some say it was stressed rocks releasing electrical charges. Others swear it was something far stranger. And if that wasn't eerie enough, church bells in Boston, over 1,000 miles away, began ringing on their own as shockwaves rippled through the earth's crust like a stone dropped in a pond. But the land itself bore the strangest scars. In Tennessee, the ground split open in gaping fissures, spewing sand and coal like some ancient beast exhaling. Whole forests sank overnight, replaced by a sprawling new body of water, Reelfoot Lake, a hauntingly beautiful accident of nature created in mere moments by the quake's violent rearranging of the earth. Even today, locals whisper about the sunken lands, where trees still stand beneath the water, their branches frozen in time. What made these quakes so bizarre wasn't just their power, it was their location. Unlike California's fault lines, the New Madrid zone sits in the middle of the continent, far from the tectonic boundaries we associate with earthquakes. Yet for 3 terrifying months, this quiet stretch of land became the epicenter of destruction, with quakes so intense they were felt as far as Canada and the East Coast. And here's the chilling part: scientists say it could happen again. The ground here doesn't shake often, but when it does, the earth itself seems to play by its own rules. Long before the ground split open beneath New Madrid, whispers of warning traveled through the land, and some say they came straight from the legendary Shawnee leader Tecumseh. Just months before the first massive quake struck, Tecumseh had reportedly traveled among tribes and settlers with an eerily specific prophecy that when the earth shook violently, it would be a sign for native nations to rise against American expansion. Some accounts claim he even stamped his foot during a speech and declared, "When I return to Detroit, I will stamp my foot, and every house in this land will tremble." Whether coincidence or something more, those words took on a chilling new meaning when the earthquakes began, but Tecumseh wasn't the only harbinger of disaster. Settlers reported bizarre animal behavior in the days leading up to the quakes, flocks of birds abandoning their nests midwinter, packs of wolves howling at odd hours, even cattle refusing to enter barns as if sensing some invisible danger. One farmer swore his dogs had whimpered and dug frantically at the ground hours before the first tremor hit. Today, scientists theorize animals might detect subtle seismic shifts or gases released before an earthquake, but to frontier families, it felt like the natural world itself was sounding an alarm. The quakes didn't just reshape the land, they reshaped folklore. Stories spread of earthquake witches, shadowy figures blamed for the destruction, and settlers whispered that the tremors were divine punishment for broken treaties with native tribes. Some native oral traditions, meanwhile, spoke of the quakes as the earth serpent stirring beneath the land, a reminder of nature's power over man. Even years later, the events haunted the American imagination, inspiring tall tales of rivers boiling with earthquake whiskey and forests that walked across the land when no one was looking. What makes these accounts so fascinating isn't just their strangeness, it's how they reveal the collision of science and superstition in early America. For settlers, the quakes were supernatural omens. For native tribes, they were part of a deeper narrative about land and resistance. And for us today, they're a reminder that the Earth's most violent moments don't just leave cracks in the ground, they leave cracks in the way we see the world. Charleston, South Carolina, was the picture of Southern grace in the summer of 1886, until the night of August 31st, when the Earth decided to rewrite the city's story. Around 9:50 in the evening, without so much as a whisper of warning, a quake estimated at magnitude 7.3 tore through the city. Buildings crumbled like sandcastles, chimneys toppled into streets, and gas lines burst, setting fires that glowed against the chaos. But what made this quake truly unnerving wasn't just its violence. It was the fact that Charleston sat hundreds of miles from any known fault line. Science had no explanation for why the ground here, of all places, would rebel so fiercely. Then came the surreal aftermath, streets cracked open, spewing geysers of wet sand volcanoes. Locals called them, some reaching heights of 6 feet. Graveyards weren't spared either. Coffins erupted from the earth, their lids split open by the force, as if the dead themselves were fleeing the chaos. One witness described a cemetery where the ground had boiled like a pot, leaving caskets jutting from the soil at grotesque angles. Even nature seemed confused. Wells ran dry or turned brackish overnight, and fish washed up on riverbanks miles inland, as if the very water had been shaken loose from its course. But perhaps the strangest detail, many swore they'd seen it coming. In the days before the quake, residents reported oppressive heat, hazy skies, and an eerie stillness, what some dubbed earthquake weather. Dogs howled incessantly, horses bolted for no reason, and one account tells of a flock of birds abandoning their nests en masse. Scientists today dismiss the idea of weather predicting quakes, but try telling that to Charlestonians in 1886. To them, the air itself had felt charged, thick with a tension that only made sense in hindsight. The quake's reach was almost as bizarre as its origin. Shockwaves rattled cities as far as Chicago and Milwaukee, swayed chandeliers in Boston, and even cracked plaster in New York. Church steeples in Alabama reportedly twisted like corkscrews from the force. Yet in some towns just 50 miles from Charleston, barely a tremor, it was as if the quake had chosen its targets with a capricious hand. Rebuilding took years, but the quake left more than physical scars. It sparked debates that still linger. Could stable regions like the East Coast really hide deadly faults? And why did some survivors swear they'd heard a low, thunderous roar moments before the ground moved, a sound with no scientific explanation? Charleston's earthquake wasn't just a disaster, it was a riddle wrapped in destruction that reminds us even the quietest ground can hold secrets. Charleston's nightmare didn't end when the shaking stopped. In the months and even years after that fateful night, something peculiar happened. Residents kept feeling the ground move beneath them. They'd swear they'd just lived through another tremor, only to check seismographs and find nothing. No needles jumped, no instruments detected even a whisper of movement. Yet the people of Charleston insisted the earth was trembling again. Doctors dubbed it earthquake sickness, a phantom sensation so vivid it left survivors questioning their own senses. Some described it as a lingering dizziness, like stepping off a boat onto solid land that refused to stay still. Others felt sudden, unmistakable jolts, doors rattling, china clinking, except no one else in the room noticed a thing. So what caused these ghostly quakes? One theory points to trauma rewiring the brain. After enduring something as violent as an earthquake, the body might remain on high alert, interpreting every creak of a floorboard or rumble of a carriage as the start of another disaster. It's the same phenomenon soldiers experience after battle hypervigilance, turning ordinary sounds into threats. For Charlestonians, the world had become a place where the ground could betray you at any moment, and that fear didn't fade just because the fault lines went quiet. But there's another, eerier possibility. Some scientists suggest these phantom quakes could be microtremors, shifts too subtle for instruments of the time to detect, yet still palpable to those attuned to the land's rhythms. After all, Charleston's quake had fractured the earth in ways no one fully understood. Could lingering instability have sent faint echoes through the ground, like a bell that hadn't quite finished ringing? The psychological toll was undeniable. Newspapers from the era are filled with accounts of sleepless nights, families sleeping in parks for fear of collapsing roofs, and businessmen who jumped at the sound of a slamming door. Churches saw spikes in attendance, with sermons warning of divine judgment. The quake hadn't just cracked walls, it had cracked the city's sense of security. Even decades later, elderly survivors would startle at minor vibrations, their bodies remembering what their minds want to forget. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of these phantom shocks is how they blurred the line between memory and reality. For Charleston, the earthquake wasn't a single event, it was a shadow that lingered, a reminder that the earth's silence could be just as unsettling as its rage. And in a way, those uncanny aftershocks taught us something profound. Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones you can see. The morning of April 18, 1906, began like any other in San Francisco until the earth roared to life. The infamous earthquake that shattered the city at 5:12 a.m. wasn't just a disaster, it was a spectacle of chaos and strange survivals. Buildings crumbled into clouds of dust, gas lines ignited infernos, and amid the bedlam, an unlikely group of heroes emerged, circus elephants. Yes, you heard that right. Barnum and Bailey's troupe, stranded in the city during their tour, reportedly used their immense strength to clear wrecked streets and calm terrified crowds. Witnesses swore the elephants moved fallen beams like toothpicks, their steady presence somehow soothing amidst the panic. One even claimed a matriarch elephant gently herded lost children to safety with her trunk, as if she understood the human need for comfort in the madness. Then there was the man who turned his front door into a life raft. As firestorms raced through the city, one survivor found himself trapped between collapsing buildings and walls of flame, until he wrenched his own door from its hinges and floated through the burning streets on it, paddling past debris like some macabre canoe trip. He wasn't the only one thinking outside the box. Others jumped into wells to escape the heat, or buried themselves in piles of wet laundry to survive. Desperation breeds creativity, but few could have predicted the surreal scenes of 1906, but the strangest fallout, the legal warfare over dynamite. With fires spreading uncontrollably, officials made a drastic call. They'd blast entire blocks of buildings to create firebreaks. The plan backfired literally. Misfired dynamite sometimes spread flames further, and property owners later sued the city, arguing their buildings had been sacrificed for nothing. Courtrooms buzzed with bizarre debates. Was it negligence or necessity? Could you even assign blame when the entire city was a disaster zone? One judge reportedly threw up his hands and muttered that the laws of man weren't written for the whims of the earth. Even nature seemed to toy with the city. Survivors swore they saw the bay's waters recede dramatically before sloshing back in miniature tsunamis, and dogs howled for days before the quake, as if sounding an alarm no human could hear. The weirdest detail, some clocks stopped at exactly 5:12 not from damage, but because the quake's first jolt had literally shaken their mechanisms into frozen silence. San Francisco rebuilt, but the quake left a legacy of oddities that still fascinate. It wasn't just bricks and mortar that shifted that day, it was reality itself, bending just enough to let circus elephants become heroes and doors transform into lifelines. And maybe that's the real lesson of 1906. When the earth forgets its own rules, humans and animals will rewrite the playbook on the fly. The earth had finished its violent tantrum, the fires were slowly dying down, and San Francisco lay in ruins, but the greatest mystery of the 1906 quake was just beginning. Scientists rushed to study the aftermath, expecting to find a massive gash in the earth where the San Andreas Fault had ruptured. Instead, they found almost nothing. The infamous fault line, which should have left a scar smile across the landscape like a visible wound, had seemingly vanished without a trace. Teams scoured the countryside on horseback, surveying equipment in tow, only to return baffled. Where were the towering cliffs, the deep trenches, the unmistakable evidence of the Earth's split personality? All they found were a few cracked fence lines and disturbed streams, trivialities compared to the devastation in the city. It was as if the fault had played a cosmic trick, like a burglar who cleans up after the crime. This wasn't just confusion, it was a crisis for geology itself. At the time, scientists still clung to the old, elastic rebound theory, which imagined earthquakes as simple springs snapping back into place. The Earth's crust was thought to be solid and unyielding, with faults as fixed, permanent features, but San Francisco's disappearing act shattered that certainty. How could a fault powerful enough to level a city leave no clear trace? The answer would rewrite science itself. Enter Henry Fielding Reid, a Johns Hopkins professor who saw the invisible. While others searched for gaping wounds in the earth, Reid noticed something subtler. Survey markers near the fault had shifted, not by much, just a few feet, but in perfect alignment. His elastic rebound theory proposed that stress built up slowly over decades until snap. The land suddenly lurched forward, releasing energy. The fault wasn't missing. It had moved horizontally, sliding past itself like two sheets of ice rubbing together. This explained why the damage seemed to leapfrog down the coast, leaving zigzagging cracks in roads and rails rather than one clean split, but acceptance came slowly. Old guard geologists scoffed at the idea of continents playing bumper cars. It took until the 1960s for plate tectonics to cement Reid's revelation as fact that the Earth's crust is a restless jigsaw, with the San Andreas as one grumbling seam. Today, we know that very same motion is still happening, millimeter by millimeter, as California inches toward Alaska at the speed of a growing fingernail. The 1906 quake didn't just break buildings, it broke paradigms. In proving faults could slip stealthily, it forced science to admit how little we truly understood the ground beneath our feet. And perhaps that's the most unnerving legacy of all. Sometimes the most dangerous faults aren't the ones you can see, but the ones hiding in plain sight, biding their time until the next great snap. On March 27, 1964, Alaska didn't just shake, it roared. At 5:36 in the evening, the second largest earthquake ever recorded tore through the state with a magnitude of 9.2, a force so powerful it briefly tilted the entire planet on its axis. The ground didn't just tremble, it lunged. Whole sections of coastline shot upward by 30 feet in seconds. yanked from the sea like a magician's tablecloth trick. In some places, the land rose so fast that mussels still clinging to rocks were left high and dry, their shells popping open in the sudden sunlight. Then came the water's revenge. As the sea rushed back to fill the voids left by the rising land, it unleashed tsunamis that carried fishing boats miles inland and dropped them like toys in forests. One wave tossed a 100-foot-long ship onto a grocery store roof in Kodiak, while in Chenega, a village was swept away entirely, leaving only a church bell tangled in the wreckage. But the strangest sight, whirlpools. In the chaos of receding and surging water, spinning vortexes opened up near the coast, some large enough to swallow small buildings whole. Witnesses described the sound as a deep, gurgling roar, like the earth itself was draining, and then silence, but not the kind you'd expect. In the days after the quake, survivors wandering the altered coastline noticed something eerie. The sand was singing. With every step, the grains emitted a low, harmonic hum, a phenomenon scientists later dubbed singing sands. The quake's violence had realigned the grains just so, creating friction that turned beaches into natural instruments. To shell-shocked Alaskans, it felt like the land was whispering secrets or warnings. The quake's reach was as bizarre as its side effects. Shock waves rippled through Texas wells, sloshing water as far as South Africa, and even triggered geysers in Yellowstone to erupt off schedule. In Seattle, 900 miles away, elevator cables swayed like pendulums, and in Louisiana, swimming pools suddenly overflowed from unseen surges. Scientists later calculated the energy released was equivalent to detonating 2.5 million atomic bombs, a number so vast it's almost meaningless, like trying to count the stars during an avalanche. Yet for all its fury, the quake left oddly precise scars. Roads split cleanly down the middle, their halves offset by 15 feet, as if drawn by a drunken surveyor. Railroad tracks twisted into pretzels, their steel rails now modern art, and in Anchorage, entire neighborhoods slid into gaping earth fractures, their houses collapsing like accordions, yet a single traffic light at one intersection kept working, blinking red as if nothing had happened. Alaska rebuilt, but the land never forgot. Today, you can still see barnacles fossilized 30 feet above the tide, silent witnesses to that day when the earth didn't just move, it rewrote the map. And maybe that's the real lesson of 1964. Nature doesn't just warn us with small tremors, sometimes it shouts. The same Alaskan quake that twisted railroad tracks and sent sand singing had one last cruel trick up its sleeve, a tsunami that raced south at 500 miles per hour, aiming for an unsuspecting California town. Crescent City, just shy of the Oregon border, was mostly asleep when the first wave hit around midnight, barely taller than a kitchen table. Most shrugged it off, another quirky Pacific ripple. But 3 terrifying hours later, the ocean returned with vengeance. A 20-foot wall of black water exploded through downtown, shattering storefronts, flipping cars like poker chips, and dragging entire buildings off their foundations. The force was so violent it ripped parking meters straight out of concrete, then bent them backward, as if the metal itself had tried to flee. Amid the chaos, survival came down to bizarre twists of fate. One man, swept out to sea in the churning dark, somehow found himself dumped into a redwood tree miles inland, branches cradling him like a life raft. Rescuers found him at dawn, damp and shivering but alive, staring down at a town that no longer resembled the one he'd left. Another survivor owed his life to a floating pool table, the only thing buoyant enough to keep him above the debris-choked water until daylight. Then there was the bartender who rode out the floodwaters, perched on his own counter, watching bottles of whiskey bob past like a macabre parade, their labels glowing in the moonlight. But the strangest aftermath wasn't the wreckage, it was the silence. For days afterward, the beach glittered with thousands of dead Dungeness crabs, their shells cracking underfoot like morbid confetti. Even weirder, the tsunami had carried Alaskan marine life hundreds of miles south, starfish, urchins, even chunks of kelp from waters far colder than California's, as if the ocean itself had gotten lost in the chaos. Scientists later called it a biological invasion. An ecosystem briefly turned inside out, Crescent City rebuilt, but the scars remained coded into the landscape. Today, tsunami warning sirens crown buildings like grim sentinels, and evacuation route signs dot street corners. The most haunting relic, a single parking meter salvaged from the wreckage, its bent frame displayed in the local museum, a twisted monument to the night the ocean forgot its boundaries. And perhaps that's the lesson lurking in these strange survivals. When the earth unleashes its rage, logic doesn't always apply. Sometimes you live because you landed in a tree. Sometimes your savior is a pool table, and sometimes the sea doesn't just take, it leaves behind pieces of itself, like scattered puzzle no one quite knows how to reassemble. October 17, 1989, was supposed to be a celebration, the Bay Area buzzing with World Series fever as the Oakland A's and San Francisco Giants faced off in Game 3. At 5:04 in the evening, just as the cameras panned to a wide shot of Candlestick Park, the broadcast suddenly glitched, screens flickered, then went black. For 60,000 fans in the stadium and millions watching at home, the confusion lasted only a second until the ground beneath them began to heave. The Loma Prieta earthquake, a magnitude 6.9 monster, had struck with the cruel timing of a Hollywood disaster flick, turning a baseball game into breaking news. Inside the stadium, the surreal scenes piled up, players staggered like drunkards on the pitching mound, light towers swayed like metronomes, and the crowd's roar morphed into a collective gasp. One outfielder later swore he saw the outfield wall breathe, rippling like a bedsheet in the wind. Meanwhile, across the bay, the upper deck of the Bay Bridge pancaked onto the lower level, crushing cars like soda cans, a collapse so improbable engineers initially refused to believe the reports. Traffic cameras captured the exact moment the roadway gave way, the footage later playing on loop as both a warning and a morbid curiosity, but the oddest details emerged from those who swore they'd sensed the quake coming. In the hours before it hit, dozens reported a strange earthquake odor, a metallic, sulfuric scent with no obvious source. One chemist likened it to the air right before a lightning strike, while others described it as burnt matches or sparking electrical wires. Scientists still debate whether stress in the Earth's crust could release such gases, or if it was mass hindsight playing tricks. Either way, the accounts lingered like an urban legend, proof that sometimes disasters announce themselves in ways we don't yet understand. The aftermath was its own kind of bizarre. In San Francisco's Marina District, houses tilted at drunken angles, their foundations liquefied by the shaking, yet inside, wine glasses sat unbroken on tables, paintings hung perfectly straight. A fire station slid off its foundation, only to land intact on the sidewalk below, its fire pole still vertical like some absurdist sculpture, and in one of the quake's cruelest ironies, a man escaping his collapsing apartment jumped into what he thought was a pool, only to find it empty, the water drained by the tumbler moments earlier. Loma Prieta didn't just interrupt a baseball game, it interrupted reality itself, leaving behind a mosaic of freakish survivals and chilling near misses. And for those who lived through it, the memories didn't fade like ordinary news cycles, they stuck like that unshakable smell in the air, a reminder that the ground's loyalty is never guaranteed. Amid the chaos of the Loma Prieta quake, some survivors walked away with stories so improbably lucky, they defied all odds. Take the San Francisco businessman who, in a fit of frustration after missing his usual bus, stood fuming on the sidewalk only to watch in horror as that very bus was crushed moments later by a collapsing brick facade. The timing wasn't just lucky, it was almost eerie. 5:04 in the afternoon, normally the height of rush hour, with the Bay Bridge choked with commuters. But fate had other plans. The World Series had drawn thousands home early to catch the game, thinning traffic to a fraction of its usual volume. Had the quake struck just 30 minutes later, the bridge's collapse could have claimed hundreds instead of a tragic few. Then there was the construction worker perched on the 12th floor of a half-built skyscraper when the shaking began. As the steel frame swayed violently, he clung to a beam, certain his time was up until the entire structure settled at a grotesque angle, leaving him dangling but alive. Rescuers later found him still gripping the beam, his lunchbox somehow wedged perfectly in the twisted metal beside him, its thermos unbroken. Nearby, a toddler napped in a collapsing apartment, only to wake unscathed in a cocoon of fallen plaster and blankets, as if the debris had arranged itself around her like a protective nest. Even nature seemed to play favorites. In the Santa Cruz Mountains, a redwood tree split clean down the middle during the quake, revealing a hollow core where a family of owls had taken refuge, their nest undisturbed despite the tree's violent bisection. And at a Monterey Bay fish market, a tidal surge flung a 200-pound tuna straight through a store window, only for it to land neatly in an abandoned shopping cart, as if the ocean had decided to deliver dinner with a side of dark humor. What makes these stories more than just oddball footnotes is the chilling precision of their timing. 5:04 p.m., a moment when routines were disrupted by a baseball game, when split-second decisions rerouted destinies. The quake didn't just test structures, it exposed the razor-thin line between tragedy and absurd survival. And for those who walked away, the question lingered, was it luck or something far stranger nudging the scales in their favor? On a chilly February afternoon in 2001, Seattle's iconic Space Needle was packed with tourists admiring the skyline until the ground beneath them dropped like an elevator with snapped cables. The Nisqually earthquake, a magnitude 6.8 monster, didn't just rattle the Pacific Northwest. It turned the Space Needle into a giant metronome, swaying so violently that glass panels shattered and the observation deck's brass railing bent under the weight of terrified visitors clinging to it. One woman swore she saw the city through the windows, sloshing back and forth like water in a bowl, while a security guard later described the sensation as riding a skyscraper-sized fishing pole in a hurricane. The structure was designed to withstand winds of 200 miles per hour, but this was the Earth itself playing tug of war. Below ground, the chaos took even stranger forms. In downtown Seattle, underground parking garages became disaster zones, not from collapsing concrete, but from explosive geysers bursting through the pavement. Ruptured water mains shot jets of high-pressure water 30 feet into the air, turning stairwells into makeshift waterfalls and flooding elevators with such force that car doors bent outward. One commuter returned to his vehicle to find it half submerged, floating eerily in the murky water like a scene from a sinking ship. Meanwhile, century-old brick buildings in Pioneer Square vomited their interiors onto the streets, spewing avalanches of red bricks and antique office furniture. But the quirkiest aftermath unfolded in the city's tech hub. Servers in Amazon's headquarters crashed en masse, not from the shaking, but because the quake triggered automatic fire sprinklers, dousing circuitry in a downpour no one saw coming. Over at the Seattle Public Library, books leaped from shelves in such perfect arcs that librarians later joked they'd witnessed the Dewey Decimal System in freefall. Even nature seemed confused. Puget Sound's normally placid waters churned with bizarre whirlpools, while seals at the local aquarium reportedly huddled together in a synchronized panic, their trainers later noting it was the first time they'd seen the animals react to an earthquake before humans felt it. The strangest detail, the quake's epicenter was 30 miles below the surface, so deep that some residents swore they'd felt the shaking come from above, as if the sky itself were vibrating. Scientists called it a silent quake, the kind that whispers before it roars, and for Seattle, that whisper left a legacy of oddities, a space needle that proved its resilience, parking garages that briefly resembled Old Faithful, and a city that learned even the most modern infrastructure is no match for the Earth's untamed sense of humor. Long before Seattle's sidewalks split open in 2001, the waters of Puget Sound were sending signals, if anyone had known how to read them. Fishermen and ferry captains reported strange sights in the days leading up to the Nisqually quake. Schools of salmon darting in frantic circles, octopuses abandoning their dens to crawl onto docks, even flocks of seabirds suddenly veering inland as if fleeing an invisible tide. One crabber swore his traps came up empty for the first time in decades, the seabed below eerily still, but the most chilling account came from a marine biologist tracking a pod of orcas. The whales had abruptly changed course, their haunting calls shifting to distress signals rarely heard outside of predator attacks. To those who knew the sound's rhythms, the message seemed clear. Something was wrong deep below. Science has wrestled with these accounts for centuries. Ancient Greek historians wrote of rats and snakes fleeing cities before quakes, while Chinese folklore speaks of earthquake fish, massive oarfish surfacing before disaster strikes. Modern researchers offer competing theories. Some suggest animals detect P waves, the fast-moving seismic vibrations that precede the main quake by seconds. Others point to changes in groundwater chemistry or subtle electromagnetic shifts, phenomena humans can't perceive, but might send birds scattering or dogs howling. Then there's the gas theory. As tectonic stress builds, rocks release charged particles that could literally electrify the air, creating an unsettling charge sensitive creatures can't ignore. But skeptics counter with cold statistics. For every verified case of animal premonition, there are dozens of false alarms, random oddities later tied to weather, pollution, or plain coincidence. After all, the ocean is a restless place. Fish act strangely all the time without the ground following suit. Even the famed quake-predicting toads of L'Aquila, Italy, who vanished days before 2009 disaster, might have simply been reacting to underground gas leaks rather than the quake itself. What makes the Puget Sound account so compelling isn't just the behavior, it's the timing. Multiple witnesses independently described the same anomalies in the same 48-hour window. Harbor seals, normally indifferent to boats, reportedly slapped their flippers in agitation when approached. Dive teams later found seafloor vents spewing warm water at unprecedented rates. And in a bizarre twist, underwater microphones picked up bursts of low-frequency noise in the days before the quake, a sound some likened to a giant dragging chains across the ocean floor. Whether instinct, sensitivity, or sheer luck, these stories force a humbling question. Have we been tuning out nature's oldest warning system? After all, earthquakes don't just start when the ground shakes, they begin with forces moving silently in the dark, long before we feel them. And if the whales and salmon of Puget Sound really did sense that build-up, their strange behavior wasn't a fluke. It was a language we're still learning to decipher. One thing's certain, next time the sea creatures start acting odd, Ceadolites might want to check their earthquake kits, just in case. August 23, 2011, was a quiet Tuesday afternoon on the East Coast until the ground decided to rewrite the rules. At 1:51 in the afternoon, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake struck near Mineral, Virginia, a tremor strong enough to rattle the unshakable, the Washington Monument. 500 miles from the nearest active fault line, the iconic obelisk cracked like an eggshell, its marble facade splitting open as if the earth itself had taken a chisel to it. Tourists at the base watched in horror as debris rained down, forcing the monument to close for years, but the real surprise wasn't the damage, it was where the shaking reached. All the way in New York City, office workers in midtown skyscrapers felt their desks lurch, sending coffee cups flying and sparking a stampede for stairwells. For a city still haunted by 9/11, the sight of panicked professionals flooding into the streets had an eerie resonance. Only this time, the threat wasn't terrorism. It was geology with a sense of irony. Speaking of irony, few images were as surreal as the Pentagon evacuation. The very fortress built to withstand attacks found itself emptying its halls, not for planes or bombs, but for the untamable whims of tectonic plates. Security footage later showed generals and clerks alike spilling onto the lawns. their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. The same military complex that had stared down human enemies for decades was now at the mercy of a force no strategy could outmaneuver. One staffer later joked that the Earth had pulled off the ultimate sneak attack, hitting a building designed to survive everything except maybe Mother Nature's bad mood. But the quirkiest aftermath wasn't in Washington or New York. It was in Louisa County, Virginia, near the Quake's epicenter. There, a local winery discovered their barrels had been rocked so violently that the aging process accelerated overnight, leaving their reds tasting years older. Some vintners called it earthquake vintage, a happy accident born from chaos. Meanwhile, at the National Zoo, keepers rushed to check on their most sensitive residents, the flamingos, who'd huddled together in a nervous pink cluster, and a gorilla named Kuja, who promptly built himself a fort from scattered branches as if expecting aftershocks. Even animals, it seemed, knew the rules had changed. Scientists later called it a blind thrust quake, the kind where the fault ruptures deep underground without breaking the surface, leaving no visible scar. That explained why East Coasters were so baffled without the familiar cracks in the earth. The shaking felt almost like a prank, but the deeper lesson lingered long after the aftershocks faded. Nowhere in America is truly earthquake-proof. Not monuments, not military headquarters, not even a 10th floor cubicle in Manhattan. The Earth keeps its own schedule, and sometimes it sends a reminder that even the steadiest ground can betray you when you least expect it. The North Anna nuclear power station had backup plans for hurricanes, cyber attacks, even plane crashes, but when the Virginia earthquake struck in 2011, the facility faced a scenario no one had fully anticipated. As the ground heaved, 12 of the plant's 13 electrical transformers failed in seconds, cutting off power to critical cooling systems. For 4 tense minutes, the nuclear reactors teetered on the brink, relying solely on diesel generators, a last line of defense against catastrophe. Workers described the surreal scene: alarm lights flashing, sirens wailing, and the unnerving vibration of the plant's massive concrete walls, designed to withstand direct missile strikes but now trembling like a house of cards. Outside, security cameras captured the moment the shaking knocked a water tower clean off its supports, sending a flood cascading toward the backup generators. Had those engines failed, the result could have been a slow-motion nightmare, a repeat of Fukushima's meltdown, but on American soil, what made this near-miss especially chilling was the geology beneath their feet. Unlike the West Coast's fractured, young rocks that absorb seismic waves like a sponge, the East Coast sits atop ancient bedrock, hard, dense, and brittle. Picture dropping a marble onto a granite counter versus a mattress. The marble bounces farther and faster on the stone. That's exactly how earthquake energy behaves out east. A magnitude 5.8 quake in California might rattle dishes, but the same tremor in Virginia can topple chimneys and crack monuments because the rigid bedrock carries vibrations with terrifying efficiency. Scientists call it low attenuation, the Earth's version of a megaphone, amplifying every jolt across hundreds of miles. The North Anna plant ultimately dodged disaster. The diesels held, the reactors cooled, and the water tower's collapse missed critical equipment by a hair. But the event exposed a gap in seismic preparedness nobody had taken seriously. Post-quake inspections revealed cracked concrete in the plant's intake structure, the very barriers meant to shield against flooding. Even weirder, the quake had subtly shifted the ground beneath the reactors, misaligning pipes by fractions of an inch, enough to prompt months of recalibration. Perhaps the starkest lesson came from the paperwork. When engineers reviewed the plant's original 1970s blueprints, they found the seismic risk assessment had been based on historical data from, wait for it, the 1800s. America's eastern nuclear facilities had been built for a geological reality that no longer existed. The Earth, it seemed, had outmaneuvered human calculus. And that's the haunting truth lurking beneath this close call. Sometimes the past isn't just prologue, It's a warning we don't recognize until the ground itself forces us to look. The summer of 2017 in Yellowstone National Park wasn't marked by geyser eruptions or roaming bison, but by something far more unsettling. Beneath the tranquil meadows and bubbling hot springs, the earth began whispering. Then shouting. Over 3 relentless months, more than 2,300 earthquakes rattled the park in what scientists called a swarm, a relentless drumbeat of tremors that sent conspiracy theorists into overdrive and even had seasoned geologists double-checking their data. Most were minor, barely strong enough to ripple a coffee cup, but their sheer numbers, sometimes clustering 80 quakes in a single day, felt like nature was running a stress test on one of the most volatile pieces of real estate on the planet. Theories spiraled faster than the tremors. Some pointed to the park's infamous supervolcano, its magma chamber lurking like a sleeping dragon beneath the surface. Could these quakes be the precursor to an eruption capable of blanketing the continent in ash? Others whispered about long, dormant fault lines, ancient fractures in the Earth's crust suddenly jolting awake like ghosts from Yellowstone's turbulent past. Then came the wildest speculation, reports of strange electromagnetic pulses detected near the quake zones, fueling whispers of secret government experiments or even alien activity beneath the park. Never mind that scientists attributed the pulses to stressed rocks generating piezoelectricity. The internet had already decided something sinister was afoot. But reality, as always, was stranger than fiction. Researchers monitoring the swarm noticed something odd. The quakes weren't clustering around the volcano's caldera, where you'd expect magma-related activity. Instead, they were concentrated near Hebgen Lake, site of a deadly magnitude 7.3 quake in 1959 that killed 28 people and birthed a new fault line overnight. The 2017 swarm seemed to be tracing that same scar, as if the earth kept poking at an old wound that never fully healed. Even weirder, the tremors often migrated in waves, jumping from one spot to another like dominoes falling in slow motion, behavior more typical of fluid movement than brittle rock fracturing. That fluid might hold the key. Some scientists hypothesized that superheated water, pressurized by Yellowstone's geothermal plumbing, was seeping into cracks and lubricating faults, essentially greasing the gears for mini-quakes. Others suggested tiny magma intrusions, not enough to fuel an eruption but sufficient to nudge the ground like a restless sleeper, the most fascinating detail. This wasn't even Yellowstone's largest recorded swarm. That honor goes to 2010, when over 3,000 quakes shook the park in a month. But 2017 stood out for its duration, its persistence gnawing at the public's nerves like a suspense thriller with no third act. For park rangers, the swarm became a masterclass in managing panic. Visitors flooded social media with videos of trembling trees and rippling hot springs, while doomsday preppers stockpiled gas masks. Rangers took to humor as a defense, joking that the ground's grumbling was just Old Faithful's angry cousin. Yet beneath the levity lay a sobering truth: Yellowstone doesn't operate on human timelines. Its rhythms span millennia, its language written in gas emissions and microscopic ground tilts we're still learning to decode. By autumn, the swarm faded as mysteriously as it began, leaving behind reams of data and unanswered questions. No caldera erupted, no fault split the park in two, but the event left an indelible mark, a reminder that Yellowstone's greatest spectacle isn't its geysers or wildlife, it's the raw, untamed power of the earth itself, hissing and growling just beneath our feet. And maybe that's the real lesson of the swarm. Sometimes the ground doesn't need to crack open to remind us how small we truly are. A whisper can be just as haunting as a roar. As the tremors multiplied, so did the doomsday prophecies. Across social media, threads exploded with claims that Yellowstone's earthquake swarm was the final warning before the supervolcano's inevitable eruption, a cataclysm capable of plunging the planet into volcanic winter. Survivalist forums lit up with packing lists, gas masks, potassium iodide pills, even instructions for DIY fallout shelters. By late August 2017, Wyoming's backroads saw a steady stream of pickup trucks loaded with generators and canned goods, their owners convinced they were racing against geologic doom. One prepper family famously parked their RV near the park's west entrance for weeks, scanning the horizon for ash clouds like modern-day Noah's waiting for rain. The science, of course, told a different story. While Yellowstone's magma chamber is colossal enough to fill the Grand Canyon 11 times over, it's also mostly solid, with only 5 to 15% molten rock. For an eruption to occur, that molten fraction would need to reach a critical mass. A process scientists estimate would take centuries of buildup, not months of quakes. GPS stations monitoring the park's ground deformation showed no significant uplift, and gas emissions remained stable, lacking the sulfur spikes that typically precede volcanic unrest. Even the earthquake depths pointed away from magma movement. Most tremors originated in the brittle upper crust, far above the molten chambers below, yet myths proved harder to shake than the ground itself. Viral videos claimed bison were fleeing the park, ignoring the fact that herds migrate seasonally anyway. Conspiracy theorists cited a 2016 National Geographic docudrama about Yellowstone's eruption as proof the government knew disaster was imminent. Even mainstream news segments inadvertently fueled fear by pairing ominous music with footage of steaming geysers, as if the park's normal geothermal activity had suddenly turned sinister. Geologists fought back with public Q and As, patiently explaining that earthquake swarms are Yellowstone's version of sighing, pressure valves, not ticking time bombs. They pointed to history. The park averages around 1 to 2,000 quakes yearly, most unnoticed. The 1985 swarm near Madison Junction racked up over 3,000 tremors in 3 months without a single geyser hiccup. But nuance struggled against the allure of apocalypse. One researcher compared it to trying to shout down a hurricane with a megaphone. The irony, while the supervolcano dominated headlines, the real seismic risks lurked elsewhere. The same faults responsible for the 1959 Hebgen Lake quake, which triggered deadly landslides and birthed Quake Lake, remain active. A similar event today could dam rivers, collapse roads, and strand thousands in a park with limited evacuation routes. Even Yellowstone's hydrothermal areas pose silent threats. In 2003, a newly formed steam vent near a boardwalk scalded a tourist who'd strayed off path. By winter, the panic had cooled like lava hardening into rock. Survivalists trickled home, their disaster kits unused, but the episode left a lasting lesson about fear and geology. Yellowstone doesn't do catastrophe on human schedules. It operates in geologic time, where soon might mean 10,000 years. The earthquakes weren't a countdown. They were a reminder that the earth speaks in riddles, not prophecies. And sometimes the most dangerous fault lines aren't in the ground. They're in the way we choose to listen. For decades, Oklahoma barely registered on America's seismic radar until the ground suddenly had other plans. Between 2009 and 2016, the state went from averaging 2 earthquakes a year to suffering more than 900, some strong enough to crack foundations and send grocery store shelves toppling. The culprit, not some ancient fault finally waking up, but something far more modern: the oil and gas industry's thirst for disposal wells. As fracking operations boomed, they pumped billions of gallons of wastewater, a salty, chemical-laced byproduct, back into the earth, injecting it deep underground where the fluid pressure pried apart long dormant faults like a crowbar. Nature retaliated with a vengeance. The strangest evidence of this man-made seismic rebellion wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the details. In Prague, Oklahoma, a magnitude 5.6 quake in 2011 didn't just rattle windows. It split the concrete stands at Oklahoma State University's football stadium like a giant had taken a cleaver to them. Meanwhile, farmers reported cows behaving bizarrely hours before tremors, clustering together and lowing anxiously as if sensing the coming shockwaves. One rancher swore his herd refused to enter their barn for days before a quake, opting instead to huddle in open fields, a behavior scientists later linked to animals detecting subtle electrical changes in the air. Even geology seemed to mock human arrogance. The town of Cushing, home to one of the world's largest oil storage hubs, became an ironic epicenter of quakes, with tremors rattling the very tanks holding the product that caused them. In 2016, a magnitude 5.8 quake, Oklahoma's strongest ever recorded, sent storage tank roofs buckling and pipelines shuddering, as if the earth itself was reminding the industry who was really in charge. The backlash was swift. Insurance claims skyrocketed, with one homeowner awarded $1.5 million for quake damage to her chimney. Churches canceled services over safety concerns, and schools conducted earthquake drills more often than tornado drills. By 2015, the state was forced to admit the connection, slashing injection volumes and shuttering hundreds of wells. Almost overnight, quake frequency dropped by half, proof that human hands could both provoke and pacify the Earth's temper. What makes Oklahoma's earthquake epidemic so unnerving isn't just the science, it's the symbolism. Here was a place where industry reshaped the very ground beneath people's feet, where progress came with literal fault lines. And perhaps the most haunting lesson, sometimes the Earth doesn't need millennia to revolt. Just a few years of human arrogance will do. The courtroom drama that followed Oklahoma's earthquake surge was as surreal as the tremors themselves. Oil executives in tailored suits found themselves squirming under oath, forced to explain how their wastewater injections, something once considered as routine as taking out the trash, had turned the state into a seismic pinball machine. One particularly memorable hearing featured a corporate geologist struggling to define induced seismicity for a baffled jury, his technical jargon crumbling under the weight of homeowners' photos showing cracked foundations and toppled chimneys. The irony was thick enough to slice. The very industry that had built Oklahoma's economy was now being sued for shaking it apart. Then came the landmark case of Sandra Ladra, a grandmother whose fireplace collapsed onto her lap during a magnitude 5 quake in 2015. Her lawsuit against 3 energy companies wasn't just about medical bills. It became a rallying cry, proving that individuals could fight back against corporate giants. The courtroom gasped when her lawyer played security footage of the quake's violence, shelves in her home exploding like dominoes as she scrambled for cover. The jury's verdict guilty. The companies settled for an undisclosed sum, but the precedent was set. Oklahoma's earthquakes weren't acts of God, they were acts of negligence. But the strangest twist wasn't in the lawsuits, it was in the science experiments that followed. Desperate to curb the quakes, regulators turned to a surprising tactic: teamwork. They forced rival oil companies to share injection data in real time, creating an unprecedented seismic truce. Operators near fault lines had to dial back wastewater volumes like DJs lowering a bass line, their compliance monitored by a network of newly installed seismometers. The result: quakes dropped by half in 2 years, a rare case of corporate fingers pulled from proverbial dams. Even religion got involved. In Cushing, a pastor famously sermonized about the quakes as the Earth's lament, his Sunday services punctuated by aftershocks that rattled the stained glass. Meanwhile, engineers devised earthquake-proof oil tanks equipped with floating roofs, a bizarre marriage of industry innovation and geologic penitence. The final reckoning came when Oklahoma's own government, long resistant to linking fracking and quakes, released a study confirming what victims had claimed for years. With that, the denials crumbled faster than a poorly built brick wall. New regulations capped injection volumes, shut down wells near faults, and transformed Oklahoma into an accidental laboratory for man-made disaster management. What lingers isn't just the legal precedent, it's the poetic justice. An industry built on extracting the Earth's secrets had forgotten one fundamental truth: the ground always keeps receipts. And when it finally presented the bill, even the slickest corporate lawyers couldn't talk their way out of it. On the night of January 26, 1700, the Pacific Northwest vanished in the dark. No European settlers stood scribbling observations. No newspapers printed panicked headlines, just an entire coastline buckling under a force that left no eyewitness records. Yet this wasn't some phantom disaster. Centuries later, scientists would stitch together the truth from two unlikely sources: Japanese monks obsessively tracking orphan tsunamis and Native American stories whispering of a great shaking passed down through generations. Half a world away, the clues began with water. Village elders along Japan's coast had long puzzled over a tsunami that struck without warning on that moonlit winter night, flooding rice paddies and smashing fishing boats. Their meticulous records described waves higher than the tallest pine, yet no earthquake had rattled their islands beforehand. For 300 years, this rogue wave remained a mystery until the 1990s, when geologists matched the Japanese accounts to sediment layers along Oregon and Washington's coasts. The correlation was chilling. The same submerged fault capable of producing a magnitude 9 quake, the Cascadia subduction zone, had unleashed a tsunami so powerful it crossed the Pacific in 10 hours. Meanwhile, inland, native oral traditions painted an eerily precise picture. The Cowlitz people spoke of Thunderbird and Whale, whose battles shook the earth so violently that entire villages slid into the sea. The Maka told of a night when the ocean rose up and swallowed the land, leaving canoes stranded in treetops. Most haunting were the ghost forests, stands of drowned cedar along the coast, their roots still anchored in saltwater-killed soil, silent witnesses to sudden subsidence. Core samples later confirmed the trees had died simultaneously, their growth rings frozen in 1700, modern technology filled in the gruesome details. Turbidite deposits layers of undersea landslide debris revealed the quake likely lasted 4 endless minutes, longer than any human scream. Coastal land dropped by 6 feet in places, inviting the tsunami's hungry surge. And the silence afterward, that wasn't poetic license. With no written records, the disaster faded into geologic rumor until science gave it voice. What makes Cascadia's ghost quake so unnerving isn't just its power, but its patience. The fault ruptures every few centuries, its cycle measured in lifetimes, not years. And when it wakes again, the stories won't be whispers in cedar or ink on monk scrolls. They'll be written in the rubble of cities built where the earth forgets nothing. Today's Pacific Northwest lives with a quiet, creeping dread, the knowledge that the ground beneath Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver could unleash a catastrophe far beyond anything California's San Andreas Fault has ever produced. Scientists call it the Big One, a potential magnitude 9 earthquake from the Cascadia subduction zone, the same fault that silently shattered the coast in 1700. The parallels between then and now aren't just eerie, they're a masterclass in human vulnerability. Imagine standing in downtown Portland when the shaking starts. Unlike California's sharp, jerky quakes, Cascadia's would unfold in slow, rolling waves, each one building in strength for 4 endless minutes, long enough for skyscrapers to sway like metronomes, bridges to snap like twigs, and brick buildings to crumble into clouds of dust. But the real nightmare begins when the shaking stops. Within 20 minutes, a wall of black water could surge inland, swallowing coastal towns whole. The same tsunami that left Japanese monks baffled in 1700 would today hit a shoreline crowded with beachfront hotels, nuclear power plants, and aging oil pipelines. What makes Cascadia's threat so uniquely terrifying isn't just its power, it's our unpreparedness. Much of the region's infrastructure was built before scientists even knew the fault existed. Sewer systems in Portland still rely on century-old pipes likely to fracture, spilling untreated waste into streets already choked with debris. Dozens of schools and fire stations in the tsunami zone sit on low-lying land, their evacuation routes leading straight into the wave's path. Even Boeing Field, Seattle's critical emergency aviation hub, was constructed on liquefiable soil that could turn to quakes and under prolonged shaking. Yet the most unsettling detail lies in the fault's patience. Cascadia ruptures roughly every 200 to 500 years, and its last major quake was 324 years ago. Geologists liken it to a coiled spring, accumulating strain with each passing decade. GPS data shows the coastal plate is being dragged relentlessly downward, buckling like a car hood in slow motion until, snap, it finally recoils. The energy released could be 30 times greater than San Andreas worst, with shaking felt as far away as Montana. Modern technology offers chilling glimpses of what's coming. Computer simulations show tsunami waves surging up the Columbia River, swamping ports and poisoning freshwater supplies with salt water. Submarine scans reveal underwater landslides primed to collapse during the quake, creating secondary tsunamis that could strike minutes after the first. Even the region's famed evergreen forests hint at the danger. Scientists have found evidence of ghost surges, past tsunamis that carried salt-tolerant plankton miles inland, leaving silent traces in the soil. Despite the doom-scrolling potential, there's a sliver of hope. Cities like Cannon Beach, Oregon, have relocated schools to high ground, while Washington state now requires tsunami evacuation towers in vulnerable areas. Engineers are testing resilient bridges that can flex like willow branches during quakes, and some coastal tribes are reviving traditional raised longhouse designs, blending ancient wisdom with modern survival. The lesson of Cascadia isn't just about fear, it's about time. The fault operates on a scale that dwarfs human lifespans, its cycles measured in civilizations, not calendars. And that's the cruelest twist. The longer the quiet lasts, the louder the reckoning will be. For now, the Pacific Northwest lives in the uneasy gap between someday and today, where every minor tremor begs the question, was that the first whisper of the Earth's next great roar? The night of August 17, 1959, was supposed to be the tail end of a perfect summer evening at Montana's Hebgen Lake, campfires crackling, families nestled in sleeping bags, the water reflecting a sky stuffed with stars. Then at 11:37 p.m., the Earth yawned open, a magnitude 7.3 quake, one of the strongest ever recorded in the Rockies, sent 80 million tons of rock thundering down the mountainside, burying half a mile of shoreline under 400 feet of rubble. The landslide moved faster than a freight train, sweeping entire campsites into the lake before anyone could scream. One survivor later described the sound as 1,000 dump trucks unloading at once, followed by a wave taller than the trees, slamming into the opposite shore with enough force to snap pines like toothpicks. In the chaos, nature played cruel tricks. The landslide dammed the Madison River so completely that within weeks, the backed-up waters formed an entirely new body, Quake Lake, its surface eerily studded with the tops of drowned trees. But the real horror lurked beneath. Divers later reported a submerged forest frozen in time, skeletal branches swaying in the current like ghosts reaching for the surface. Worse were the relics of the campsite itself: coolers, tents, even a child's shoe still wedged between rocks, preserved in the icy depths. Miracles emerged from the wreckage. One family survived by clinging to their capsizing cabin as it floated across the newly formed lake, crashing into the far shore like a shipwreck. Rescuers pulled a 5-year-old boy from the rubble after 36 hours, his tiny hand barely visible under a slab of sandstone. He'd been shielded by the body of his older sister, who didn't survive. Another man was found wedged in the twisted metal of his car, alive but pinned so tightly that rescuers had to use blowtorches to free him. His words when they reached him, "I dreamed you were coming," but not all the stories ended with survival. 19 people vanished that night, some buried so deep their bodies were never recovered. To this day, locals swear the lake is restless phantom campfire lights flickering on the shore, voices whispering in the wind, even the distant sound of children laughing where no children should be. Park rangers tell of hikers who insist they've seen a woman in a soaked summer dress standing knee-deep in the water, staring at the spot where her tent once stood. When approached, she vanishes, leaving only ripples. Geologically, the quake left scars just as haunting. The landslide created a natural dam so unstable engineers had to blast a spillway to prevent catastrophic flooding, a temporary fix that's held for over 60 years. The lake itself is a ticking clock. Someday, erosion will win, and the Madison River will reclaim its path in another violent surge. Until then, Quake Lake remains a monument to nature's fickleness, a graveyard, a tourist attraction, and a warning all at once. Stand on its shores today, and you'll feel it, the uncanny silence where laughter and screams once mixed. The way the water seems to hold its breath. This isn't just a lake. It's a tomb with a view, and beneath its glassy surface, the earth still murmurs the names of those who never made it home. Before the tremors faded, Yellowstone's geysers began rewriting their own rules. Old Faithful, the park's famously punctual performer, started hiccuping like a broken clock, its eruptions arriving minutes early or late, as if the quake had shaken loose its internal rhythm. Meanwhile, Steamboat Geyser, long dormant between record-breaking blasts, suddenly roared to life with a frequency unseen in decades, shooting water 400 feet into the air like a champagne cork freed from pressure. But the strangest transformation happened to Porkchop Geyser. Once a modest bubbling pool, it exploded with such violence in the months after the swarm that its crater split open like a split melon, leaving behind a gaping hole that never bubbled again. Scientists pounced on the chaos like detectives at a crime scene. The quakes had acted like a colossal plumbing inspection, sending vibrations deep into Yellowstone's hydrothermal maze. By tracking how geyser behavior shifted, researchers pieced together hidden connections between underground chambers, tunnels of scalding water and steam normally invisible to instruments. Some geysers, it turned out, shared secret aquifers. When one changed its pattern, others downstream followed suit like dominoes. The tremors also revealed fracture gates, microscopic cracks that act like valves, controlling how often geysers erupt. Quake-induced shifts in these gates explained why some geysers sped up while others fell silent, the Earth's equivalent of tightening or loosening a faucet. The most groundbreaking discovery lay in the timing. Geysers that altered their schedules immediately after quakes were feeding off shallow reservoirs, their water supplies easily rattled by seismic waves. Those with delayed reactions drew from deeper, more insulated pockets, proof that Yellowstone's hydrothermal system was layered like an onion, each level responding to trauma on its own timeline. Even the geysers that didn't change became data points, their resilience hinting at pockets of stability in an otherwise volatile underworld. For park rangers, the changes posed surreal challenges. Visitor bulletins had to be rewritten on the fly, with Old Faithful's predicted eruption times adjusted weekly. Tourists hoping to see Steamboat's rare displays suddenly found themselves front row to near-monthly spectacles, while once reliable features like Daisy Geyser left crowds waiting in vain. The ground's restless energy even birthed new attractions. A previously nameless hot spring near Porcelain Basin began erupting erratically, earning the nickname Swarm Surprise from baffled guides. What makes this seismic reshuffling so invaluable isn't just the science, it's the humility. Yellowstone's geysers have been erupting for millennia, their patterns etched into guidebooks as immutable fact. But in months, a few thousand tremors proved how fragile that predictability really is. The park's plumbing isn't some static museum piece, it's a living, shifting network where even the smallest geologic nudge can rewrite the rules. And perhaps that's the real lesson stemming from these cracked basins. Nature doesn't do guarantees, only possibilities. Even the steadiest geyser is one quake away from becoming a completely different beast. The 4th of July in Ridgecrest, California, started with a bang, but not the fireworks kind. At 10:33 in the morning on July 4, 2019, a magnitude 6.4 earthquake ripped through the Mojave Desert, snapping roads like dry spaghetti and sending shockwaves all the way to Las Vegas. But this was just the opening act. 34 hours later, as crews were still assessing damage, the Earth unleashed its real fury, a magnitude 7.1 quake so powerful it permanently altered the landscape. Satellite images later showed the ground had literally stretched, with entire sections of desert now offset by up to 15 feet. One rancher returned to his property to find a fence that once stretched straight for miles now zigzagging like a child's doodle, the steel posts wrenched apart by forces no welder could fix. Then came the surreal side effects. At the Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake, just 12 miles from the epicenter, the shaking rattled loose something unnerving unexploded bombs. Decades-old munitions, long buried in storage bunkers, rolled into the open like forgotten toys tumbling from a closet. EOD teams spent days carefully securing everything from aging artillery shells to unarmed testing devices, their work slowed by relentless aftershocks that kept shifting the deadly cargo. Meanwhile, at a nearby Air Force base, security cameras caught a bizarre sight. An entire row of F-35 fighter jets, each weighing over 20 tons, wobbling on their wheels like shopping carts in a windstorm. But the weirdest evidence of the quake's power wasn't visible to the naked eye. It was in the GPS data. Scientists discovered the tremors had nudged the entire region westward, with some areas near the rupture zone permanently displaced by nearly 2 feet. Los Angeles, over 100 miles away, slid a hair's breadth closer to San Francisco. Even more unsettling, the quakes didn't follow the usual rules. Instead of rupturing along a single clean fault line, they spiderwebbed through a complex network of fractures, creating a shattered mosaic of stress relief that geologists compared to watching a car window shatter in slow motion. This wasn't just an earthquake, it was a tectonic puzzle, rewriting textbooks on how faults interact. For residents, the aftermath played out in strange vignettes. One family returned home to find their swimming pool emptied not by a crack, but by the sheer force of the shaking sloshing every gallon over the edge. A gas station clerk watched helplessly as snack racks toppled in perfect sequence, sending chips cascading like dominoes. And in a twist that felt ripped from a Western movie, a long dry spring suddenly bubbled back to life outside town, its waters rising from the depths after decades of silence, proof that even the desert's ancient plumbing wasn't immune to the quake's persuasion. What makes the Ridgecrest quakes so unforgettable isn't just their power, it's their audacity. This wasn't a cautious tremor testing the waters. This was the earth flexing its creativity, cracking the desert open with the indifference of a kid tearing apart a sandcastle. And in its wake, it left reminders that no matter how much we map, predict, or prepare, the ground beneath us remains the ultimate wild card capable of shifting not just landscapes, but our very understanding of how they move. Science textbooks had always been clear. Big earthquakes spawn smaller aftershocks, not the other way around, but Ridgecrest laughed in the face of that logic. When the magnitude 6.4 quake struck on July 4th, seismologists assumed it was the main event, until the ground delivered its brutal plot twist 34 hours later with a magnitude 7.1 that made the first tremor look like a gentle warm-up. This wasn't just unusual, it shattered decades of assumptions about how earthquakes behave. Suddenly, the very definition of foreshock and aftershock was up for debate, and scientists scrambled to explain why Earth had apparently rewritten the rules without bothering to inform the experts. The real revelation came when researchers mapped the fault lines involved. Instead of a single clean rupture, the quakes had unleashed a chaotic spiderweb of at least 20 previously unknown faults, some so small they'd escaped detection until the ground itself exposed them like hidden seams in a torn fabric. Imagine pressing your palm into a sheet of ice and watching cracks radiate in every direction. That's what happened beneath the Mojave, except these fractures ran miles deep. The smaller quake hadn't been a prelude, it was part of a domino effect, with stress jumping between faults like a spark along a fuse. One geophysicist likened it to watching a Rube Goldberg machine made of tectonic plates, where each piece triggered the next in ways no model had predicted. Then there were the aftershocks, or rather, the lack of them where they were supposed to be. Traditional models expected tremors to cluster around the main rupture, but Ridgecrest's aftershocks sprayed across the desert like buckshot, some occurring weirdly far from the epicenter. Even more bizarre, the larger quake actually shut down certain fault segments nearby, like a bully stealing all the seismic stress for itself. This wasn't just academic curiosity, it had life or death implications. California's earthquake early warning system, designed around predictable aftershock patterns, suddenly seemed like it was working off an outdated playbook. The deeper scientists dug, the stranger it got. Strain measurements revealed the two quakes had released pent-up energy from different geological eras, the first from centuries of accumulated stress, the second from millennia. It was as if the Earth had uncorked two separate time capsules at once. Satellite radar images painted an even wilder picture. The ground hadn't just shifted horizontally. In some spots, it had briefly bulged upward by nearly 3 feet before settling back down, like a giant taking a breath beneath the desert. What makes Ridgecrest's rebellion against the rules so unsettling isn't just the shattered theories, it's the implications. If a smaller quake can precede a larger one without warning, and if hidden faults can team up like a pack of seismic wolves, then our entire approach to forecasting might be backwards. Suddenly, every tremor, no matter how minor, could be the first note in a deadly symphony, and that's the haunting lesson buried in Ridgecrest's dust. The Earth doesn't care about our textbooks. It writes its own rules in real time, and we're just struggling to keep up. From the Mississippi River running backward to fracking turning Oklahoma into a seismic pinball machine, America's earthquake history reads like a catalog of nature's most bizarre pranks. We've seen church bells ring 1,000 miles from the epicenter, elephants turned into rescue workers, and entire lakes born in minutes from landslides. These aren't just disasters, they're proof that when the ground decides to misbehave, it does so with a flair for the dramatic. Think about the sheer audacity of these events. A fault line so sneaky it leaves no trace after leveling San Francisco, a supervolcano whispering warnings through geysers before going quiet again, tsunamis crossing oceans to startle monks in Japan while swallowing villages on the Pacific Northwest coast. Even our own meddling pumping wastewater into the earth like it's a bottomless trash can backfire spectacularly, with Oklahoma's man-made quakes becoming a cautionary tale about playing with forces we barely understand. What ties these stories together isn't just their strangeness, it's humility. Every quake, no matter how big or small, is a reminder that the ground beneath us isn't as solid as it feels. It breathes, shifts, and occasionally throws a tantrum, indifferent to our cities, our schedules, or even our science. The best we can do is listen, to the whales fleeing before a tremor, to the ancient tribal stories that warned of shaking lands, to the quiet stress building along faults we've yet to map. So here's the question these stories leave us with. What's your earthquake tale? Maybe you've felt a phantom tremor no one else noticed, or your grandparents passed down a wild survival story from the big one. Share it in the comments because every quirk, every close call, adds another piece to this puzzle. And if you're lucky enough to live where the ground's been quiet, don't get too comfortable. Toss some extra water and batteries in your emergency kit. Learn your evacuation routes and remember, the Earth doesn't give warnings. It just gives stories. Make sure yours has a happy ending.